On today's episode of the Grind Hours podcast is the first part of a two-part interview done with my good friend Aaron Calafato, going over a whole mess of things in terms of the technical stuff with podcasting and how it relates to the pandemic and just growing in a catalog, and you'll hear the rest of it. But that's what this week's podcasts are going to be. Today, the first part drops, and then Thursday at 9:30, the second part will drop. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the pod.
All right, we have one of the OGs of the Grind Hours podcast on a Zoom call with me. Um, it is a little different because just circumstances, and we're in quarantine. I have Aaron Calafato of 7 Minute Stories on the line, and this is a podcast that's been a couple of months in the making. We before we went on a podcast, months and maybe it's probably about a year ago, you and I had like a 20-minute conversation before we hit record about a working portfolio. And that idea has stuck in my head since then. And that was probably 2018 or somewhere around there. And now I think is the perfect time, especially with quarantine going on, to discuss the importance of one, working through the odds of everything, and also two, the importance of a working portfolio. So, and I know, I mean, you have a tremendous portfolio in the 7 Minute Stories. You just released the time that we're recording this, I think episode 88 of and I don't know when this is going to be put out, but as of right now, you've done 88 episodes of the 7 Minute Stories, and I just want to kind of reiterate what we were talking about and expand on it too, of the importance of a working portfolio and how that will change moving into post quarantine. Because if people look at your portfolio and go, a pandemic can't stop you, what, like, how
Yeah.
this dude's a soldier.
First of all, how long have we been? It's funny, relation. How long we known each other? It feels like it's been like 3 years.
Right.
Has it been like 3 years?
I think so. I'll go back after this is done and truly look at it, but I think it was 2017-ish of either 2017 or early 2018 when we've gotten a podcast together. So that's crazy to think about it too, is just how much has changed for the two of us. I'm now post by the time this goes up 200 episodes. You're probably going to be closer to 100 7-minute stories by the time this comes out, which is just insane to think about, because when you and I first got on a podcast, 7-minute stories didn't even exist yet. You didn't put one out yet.
No.
That's just, that is great. You just blew my mind. Yeah, I haven't really thought about that, and I really enjoy your podcast and what you can do with it, and what you've started to do with the expansion of the 7-minute stories with the guest stories, which is something that I don't think everybody can pull off. And you've got into a niche before anybody did, because I know there's some people on Spotify right now that the Ringer's one, who is going into shortened podcasts, and for the Hottest Take, which is the podcast that the Ringer does, it's 7 minutes as well. So getting in and getting out in 7 minutes, putting it together a cohesive, interesting podcast in 7 minutes is, and I don't want to I feel like I'm kind of degrading it in some way, but it's like the TikTok Vine format of video. It's a shortened, and it works. It clearly works. You are making a living off of doing 7 minutes a week, which, and I, as someone who's done um, 2 hour long podcast and half-hour long podcast, like I
Yeah.
understand the I, the cohesiveness of it is amazing. And um, how has that process changed in quarantine? We'll start there.
So it's interesting because the process for 7 minute stories, which has been going on, it's about a year. So there was a couple of months before where I was tweaking the process, tweaking how I was going to do it. But then I got to a point where I basically just settled on an output, which is, okay, I'm going to tell a 7 minute story every week. That was the goal. How can I tell a 7 minute story every week? And one, it played to a strength of the fact that was how I came up as a storyteller, literally, touring the country, doing monologues, theater. I kind of came out of that space in New York where that's where I was trained. Then it's like, okay, how do I take that skill set and how do I consistently give something every single week? Because I had a lot of stories, and the way I do them, it's just naturally, I'm able to, it's different. Everyone has their own abilities, but for me, I can kind of rip off story ideas and quickly distill them and then figure out a way to make them as impactful as possible. Of course, I go back and there's some more like, that episode wasn't as strong as this one, or this episode wasn't as strong as that one. But if the idea is, can I consistently every single week tell a new story? And so it started just with that, and then it was like, okay, let me reverse engineer that. Like if I can consistently tell a story, how does that output look? The benefit to your question about how it's changed in quarantine is that it hasn't changed, and the reason why is just because even though I have a team, I have someone who does the illustration for it to give it a visual aspect. I have my producer, Ken, who does the audio production, and then Corey, my fiance, she helps with a lot of the coordination stuff. All of that can be done remotely. All of that was being done remotely anyways. And so that honestly, and in fact, as terrible as what's happening outside of the walls, I've been more productive being able to do it inside the walls. So that has not changed at all. And in fact, I think what I've noticed was, in a weird way, people are the podcast has been growing for a year, and we've got that some national publication with NPR, National Public Radio, and so it's been growing by the thousands. But I think one of the reasons is that it's people are inside, they're listening. They're listening to podcasts. It might be changing because they're not commuting. It might be changing because they're not in their cars or on the subway, but they're at home more. And so I think that's helped. So from an audience perspective and a consistency perspective, I think it's a good environment to grow. Now, for you, what you're talking about, I know because I've done interview stuff before, that's harder. I mean, because that in-person interview really makes a big deal. Like if you do an interview podcast, you're listening and you're like, okay, I do an interview podcast, it changes that dynamic, and you do have to rely on the Skype or the Zoom call or whatever platform you're using. And you can do it like we're doing it right now.
Right.
And it's going to be good. But as you know, like there is something to be said about an in-person interview. So, but I know there's a lot of podcasts. I think you've always done yours remotely, right? Unless you had close guests, didn't you always do yours with a lot of remote guests as well?
I did. So, I mean, what I started it with is just 3 of my friends just saying, hey, well, let's just do this. Like we had no idea what we were doing. And we're like, let's just and it was over Hangouts first, Google Hangouts. So it was like this.
Okay.
And let's just do it. Technical difficulties was awful because all of our relying on just Wi-Fi for the structure of the podcast is a faulty premise. Then I eventually got enough money from working to get a mixer and a soundboard and microphones to up the production quality. And then I had them come in and the in-person stuff. And I mean, you and I have always been remotely over the phone or like this in a Zoom call. I have my friend Dayton, who lives in Seattle or outside of Seattle. We've always done it that way too. So I've done it both ways, but unless you have tremendous chemistry with the other person and know the cadence and when people are going to break up or break and just take a breath, the importance of an in-person interview is imperative to do I think it's imperative to do a podcast. And if you
Mhm.
learning how to do it too, because when I started to do a podcast, I only did it remotely. So to actually see the person and be able to look over and either nudge the person or tell them to keep going, um, is imperative. I think
Yeah.
it is the backbone of, and it's why like radio interviews work
Mhm.
so well. Actually getting them in the studio
Yeah.
and to, but it's also interesting how everyone's reverting back to being it remote, because the people who've done it remotely for so long are like, how, where have you guys been? Like
Right.
the this format in itself and the quarantined news show, the quarantine podcast, like this whole pandemic subgenre
Yeah.
of this medium is fascinating to me to, and I think it will benefit the podcasting as a whole, because before, celebrities who are not confined to their own houses, you'd want to get them in the studio and you'd want to get that picture with them post podcast and go, hey, look at who I got on my podcast this week. Tune in
Yeah.
whenever and listen.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, you could screenshot a Zoom call and be like, hey, look who I got on the Zoom call right now. Which, and that's the other thing is I think pairing video with podcasting, a lot of people wanted to do that. Now with Zoom, it gives you the ability to do that. I'm myself going to do that at some point too. I haven't had the capability or just uh, the right setup to do it in the past, because I would love to do it with my podcast. Just put up the two. You could probably, I mean, you could do it too with just, and even if it's a snippet, it's more about creating content in a way. And this Zoom just gives us a ability to create more content, because now you have the the visual aspect of audio, which I think what people are realizing more and more is how much they actually like seeing the video and not just the audio. I think the next step for podcasting is when you go on Spotify or Apple Music, you actually see the video aspect of the podcast. Yeah, you can listen to it when you lock your phone. You can still listen to the audio, but I think at some point Spotify will, or whoever will be the first one to do this. I think that's the next step for podcasting. And it's an interesting thing, because if you have to, because anybody could do a podcast right now. Bobby in Kansas could do a podcast on his phone, put it out through any of the number of podcasting apps in the App Store, and try to make a living. But if you have to do it visually, um, I think and that expands on creativity. Like you could do, and I don't know if you'd want to do this, but you could, like, you did the podcast today about the D-Day speech. You could
Yeah.
dress up and deliver the D-Day speech in your studio and put it out
Sure.
as a piece of content on your Instagram or Twitter or whatever. And that just gives you, or when they log in to Spotify and they see, oh, Aaron got a new 7-minute story out. Let's see what outfit he's in today. And if it's a specific podcast like that, which that's an interesting way to grow the medium. But to go back onto the rolling or the building catalog, I
Mhm.
think quarantine has given people no excuse to do it anymore, because I mean, unless you're going to the grocery store or if you actually are working, you're not going anywhere. Everyone's confined to their bedroom or a kitchen table or whatever. And I think that's what's pushing me to more to do is I don't have an excuse to be like, I don't feel like recording today, or I have a daunting edit. I don't really want to get to it. I have to go to do this, that, and the other thing. Right now, all I have to do is walk the dog, get up, read my book, and sit down and either write or record a podcast.
Feed Hudson Valley is a regional food rescue and harvesting network in the Hudson Valley operating through Dutchess, Orange, Ulster, Columbia, Greene, Putnam, and Sullivan counties. It links donors of prepared but unserved food and fresh produce with nonprofits and food assistant programs through an app-assisted network of food donors, volunteers, and feeding agencies. Feed Hudson Valley facilitates the harvesting, processing, and distribution of locally grown or produced agricultural products, self-stable food donations, and prepared nutritious foods. The app used is called Chow Match, and it is easy for volunteers to download and use. Among the donors are restaurants, farms, food makers, stores, hospitals, and universities. The food assistant programs include food pantries, soup kitchens, and shelters. Volunteers are matched through the Chow Match app when a donation is available. They can indicate that they are available to make a run and then pick it up for a donor and deliver it to the agency. The Feed Hudson Valley Network currently includes over 300 volunteers, 130 donors, and 95 receiving agencies. Last year, on average, Feed Hudson Valley rescued and redirected over 12,000 pounds of food each month. Feed Hudson Valley could use more donors and volunteers. To learn more and sign up, visit feedhv.org. Again, that's feedhv.org. One more time, spelled out, feedhv.org. Now back to the podcast.
So I think the importance of cataloging is just even more apparent, and it's a need. It's a necessity if you want to grow. And I also
I think
go ahead.
I think it's a difference maker. I think well, let me real quick go back on a couple of things you said. I think to offer a different layer, a different perspective. One, I think you have a valid point about adding a visual component to podcasting. You know, I know they've recorded interviews before they had the visual where there's a back and forth, the talking heads.
Right.
But as far as a consistent piece where you can improvise with a visual texture, like you said, I think that is. I think, and this isn't, it's not an alienating statement. I think it's a generational thing, in the sense that I think podcasting is great, not just but like because of its potential.
Right.
I find that I prefer to engage with audio purely as audio.
Okay.
And I think that comes from, I'm 37, right? And
right.
So I grew up listening to the radio, literally like a transistor radio in my room with an antenna going out the window. I had no TV. There was no, I mean, I'm not even that old, so to speak, but I mean, I'm that elder statesman millennial that grew up in that generation. I was born in 1983. I didn't have my first cell phone till I was a freshman in college. My mother had a rotary phone in her house. You literally had to dial that, dude, with like, not when you hit the 9, it was like,
you had to go back. My great grandmother had one of those.
You see, like that was, so your great grandma, that's my mom. Like, you see what I'm saying? Like, so like my mom was a little bit of a hippie. So we had some, more, just nostalgic or like retro pieces in our house. But that being said, it was still a very different world. So the way I engaged with visual media and audio was a little different. And so I obviously, I've adapted. I watch stuff on YouTube. I'm on social.
Mm-hmm.
So like, I'm not disconnected from it, but I think early on in our lives, we developed preferences. And so, that D-Day audience, right, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt gave that speech that I released today or recited, that he addressed that to the nation on the radio. And so you can imagine that world, right, on the brink of World War II when it could go either way. And I think it was, you have 100 million people at least. It was probably the largest gathering, quote unquote, mass prayer ever of people. And they're gathered around with their ears to the radio. And they're just listening to this guy's voice. Now, it didn't have a visual. It was just, And so I feel that with audio, I like the visual aspect that podcasting now in 2020 can bring. I like what you're talking about, especially in an interview setting. When you have that visual, you can see the reactions of people. You can see how they're engaging in the. I think, because I've done interview stuff, I think it's important for the genre that I'm in, especially with 7-minute stories, and I think with storytelling podcasts, there is a part of it that the audio allows the listener to create their own imagery, right? So like if I'm telling that story about me walking into the emergency room after my kid puts 2 crayons in his ear, I want them to see their own version of it instead of showing it. So I guess what I'm saying is I'm complimenting what you're saying. I'm not deducting it. I'm not saying that I think that what I love about this medium, I say all this to say, what I love about this medium is that it gives the avenue for both type of consumers. A consumer that wants a visual and an audio, and some of the old hat folks that just want to sit with something in their ear and use their imagination. But the beautiful thing about it is there's no limitations. Whereas those other mediums, they were built-in limitations. Now you get to kind of pick your own adventure, which is really cool.
I actually, what I do when I think there's 2 podcasts that I solely listen to where it's the video and the audio. But majority of the time, if there's a video present, I will listen to the podcast. And if it's somebody that I enjoy listening to, I will go back on the video and watch their reactions to some of the stuff, like the highlights that I personally like about the podcasts. And you're right, it's different. I do prefer listening to just straight audio, putting on a podcast, either writing, going for a walk, reading, whatever, and just doing my day and having it paired in my ears and just going. But the increase, and it's just like part of it also too is trial and error. Everybody could get behind video with podcasting and pairing it together, and it completely flop and doesn't do as well as just the standalone audio. But it's interesting to be a part of podcasting now. I think you and I both got into the podcasting era where it was not niche anymore. It was growing, but it's definitely not at the level it was today. If you and I said 3 years ago, hey, we got a podcast, it was something of unique. Now it's the same thing as everyone's got their own screenplay in LA. Everyone's got their own podcast about something. So, and it's interesting seeing the way that it's adapting. And I think the more and more as we get into the next decade where podcasting is going to be the prevalent audio platform, I think the importance of somebody looking back and going, how many episodes does this guy have? How many years has he been doing it? And changing. I think people, as rough as it is to go through it, producing content of the growing pains of becoming what you ultimately become, I think in some ways it's human to see the progression of somebody. And for me, in instance, I started podcasting when I was a senior in high school. I did it, that was 5 years ago. Now I'm a college graduate. I have one podcast that ended with a play-by-play and another podcast that is 200 episodes deep. And if somebody listens to the first episode of the play-by-play podcast where I'm have no idea what I'm doing, have no idea how to structure a show, to transition from one conversation to the next, dropping every other episode, to now where I have a mic and a mixer. I have some stuff of soundproofing equipment at my house in my home setup, to eventually getting to video. The growth of that and the importance of going into somebody and going into advertisers. You and I both know how tough it is to get advertising on a podcast, especially now when everyone's like, I need advertising. Like, that's a precursor to starting a podcast is getting advertising. I didn't know that when I first started to try to gauge that and get the SeatGeek sponsor, and to get some of the sponsors that I'm trying to get now. I think it is great to go to somebody, and if it's a job interview or an advertiser, and go, look at what I've done, look at how I've grown with the medium, and look at how I want to take it. Because that's the other thing, is everyone could be cookie cutter, and they could just be handing out advertisements like they're Halloween candy, and they don't care where they go. But it'll be interesting to see how many people still stay with the platform as well, because there are people that will do this just because they're stuck in quarantine and be like, hey, here's my daily quarantine podcast episode. Once quarantine's over and it adjusts back to normal life, I'm interested how everybody's going to react in terms of downloads and listenership to that. Are you seeing a spike in your listens now? Because I am.
Yeah.
It's skyrocketed for me, where it's just like, oh yeah, I thought that episode would do well, and then I look and it doubles what I think it's going to do. And that's just normal on a daily basis. But now, especially through quarantine, the listenership for podcasting and the need for an we're accompanying them in a way. And I think, I don't know, it's very, very interesting to see where podcast is at, because it's going to boom, and it's going to hit a point.
Well, I looked at my numbers, and and there's always, again, it's been lucky in the sense that, and you pointed out earlier on in the conversation, I went through some growing pains early on when, I started off as a performer, as a storyteller, as a monologuist, doing it live. And then, but there's another skill, at least for me, conversation. So I do that a lot with the media company I work for, and do interviews and lead interviews and have conversations and stuff. And so I started off doing an interview podcast. And for me, honestly, what it came down to is the way I think we can come full circle to some of the questions we can dive into about cataloging, is when I started doing an interview show and I was doing the interview, I was doing live interviews in a studio in Cleveland. I partnered with a downtown organization, and the amount of work it took to to produce one piece of content was outrageous to me. I mean, it's not that I didn't do it, I did it, but I remember being like, to just do one episode and especially if I got a big fish, like a Van Jones or,
right,
someone and we'd get those, and the preparation and the coordination, and you got to meet them here, and then they got a car, and then, it was insane. And I remember being like, holy crap, like this is the hardest thing ever. And then, by the way, at the end of the month, I would have one podcast a month. It was an hour and a half.
right.
And then I'm like, I only got one. And I was like, I only got one.
Right.
And so then it's like, man, and then on top of that, I would say, I do interviews. I love conversations, but my number one skill set is storytelling. And so I wasn't even getting to exercise that. So I had to do I had to really do some analysis and really figure out, okay, how can I use this ever-changing medium, this platform of digital audio, podcasting? How can I do it in a way in which it does two things? One, it plays to my strengths, and then two, where I can actually build a prolific catalog doing what I do best and doing what I love, regardless of money, regardless of any of that stuff. And so there were some key points and key decisions I made with 7-minute stories that was very key. One, I needed to make it short form, because I used to do monologues and they were an hour long. Well, you can do that in a live setting.
Yeah.
But in audio, I just felt like, and also too, I just had a tendency, I could tell stories in a space like that. I could figure out, it's just, I worked on that skill set for almost a decade. I could tell a story in a small package, and it's a lot packed in 7 minutes. So that's a skill. So it's not just like, oh, so I worked on that. But then to your point about kind of like a Vine model, or it's short stories.
Yeah.
It's short stories. And the other thing, what I was noticing was like, look, as podcasts were booming and more people are doing them, like you said, everyone has one, then it's overload. There's a lot of white noise. And so the idea is, okay, if I'm doing the storytelling thing, what makes it different? Well, I can, one, fit it into a space that is digestible. For me, dude, it comes from respecting the listener. So, and
Yeah.
I'm not saying that long form podcasts aren't respectful. I'm saying for me, I was like, maybe a game changer is, I know my daily life. It's hard to. I love some of my neighbors cut my grass. Like, what? My life is
Right.
insane. I can't sit down for 3 hours and listen to it like I used to. Everyone has different times, but as an adult with kids and working in media, I'm like, so for me it was like, but can I add value in a space in between a space? Can I add value from a drive to the grocery store or now a walk with your dog? Can I add value? And so that was an intentional choice. The other intentional choice, tapping into your point about advertising, I made it, and this is preference, I made an intentional choice to not do any form of advertising for 7-minute stories. One, there was a luxury there because the podcasting work I had done with my interview podcast and 7-minute stories had given me my last 2 jobs. So when people talk about revenue from podcasts, there's 2 ways. There's multiple ways, but the 2 main ones are advertise, or there's usually it's one. People go, well, you got to have advertisers. Got to have advertisers. And you're right, that is a way. For me, I was like, let me flip it and let me say, I'm not going to worry about money. The only thing I'm going to worry about is output, quality, and the catalog.
Yeah.
You're talking about the portfolio. And if I do that, I'm banking on that someone is going to notice that prolific output and then the quality of it. And then they're going to say, I want you to do something similar for me, which will then subsidize my work. So what ended up happening the last 4 years, I've worked with 2 organizations that literally brought me in to do story strategy because I demonstrated story expertise through my podcast for free. And so there's a gamble there, because you know how much it costs and what it takes to put into something. Because you're like, dude, I need to pay the bills. So there is a threshold. There's a canyon in which you make a choice to do. I want to get, advertising. I want to subsidize immediately. For me, I gambled and I was like, I believe that, podcasting can be a deferred revenue stream, meaning most people think it's immediate revenue stream. Mine is deferred so that I believe it's going to come in on the back end. So I can say, when you say do it for a living, yeah, I can say both the jobs I have now I'm a story strategist for a media company.
Right.
So it's not like, oh, I'm working at Drug Mart. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's just, I wanted to make sure that my podcasting created a livelihood in the same ecosystem, in the same world. Now I have a job that subsidizes that. And now I'm free with 7-minute stories.
Right.
If I do pick up an advertiser, like a microphone company, that's my choice. If I find something that really fits, that's my choice. But for now, I'm operating like a public broadcasting system where it's like, but because it's been subsidized. But the only reason why it's been subsidized was because I created a catalog. So there's that kind of option, there, at least some people don't know that that's an option that you can at least consider when thinking about how does this feed my family? How can I feed myself with this? It can be immediate or deferred.
That wraps up the first part of the conversation that I had with Aaron Calafato. If you want to listen to the second part of this conversation, tune in on Thursday at 9:30 a.m. Eastern Time. That's when it's going to drop. If you want to follow Aaron on Instagram or Twitter, his Instagram is at Aaron C. Calafato or at 7-Minute Stories on Instagram. On Twitter, it's at Aaron Calafato and at 7MIN Stories. Again, that's at 7MIN Stories on Twitter. On this side of the coin, at Not the Fake J Leo on Twitter, datasports.blogspot.com, and of course this podcast. If you've reached this point, please like, share, subscribe. If you're on iTunes, please give us a review. And until next time, it's closing time. You don't have to go home, but you can't stay here. Peace.